remember that morning so clearly, not because anything dramatic happened right away, but because of how soft and slow it all was. The kind of morning that used to feel sacred to me. The sun filtered in through the sheer curtains in the kitchen, warming the floor tiles just enough to make me keep my slippers off. I had a pot of chamomile tea brewing, humming low on the stove, and the faint sound of birds outside made it feel like the world had paused just for a moment. I'd always loved Sundays. There was a rhythm to them, a stillness, a breath. But that morning, the breath caught in my throat. My daughter was sitting across the table, scrolling through her phone, barely glancing up. I'd made her favorite breakfast, sourdough toast, eggs, soft but not runny, and a little fruit salad with kiwi, which she used to call green moons when she was little. But now she was 32, and she didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she did, and that was the ache that she noticed, but didn't care. We talked lightly about nothing. A new show she was watching her friend's baby shower the traffic near her condo. I asked how her fiancé was, and she said, "He's good, busy. We've been trying to limit time with distractions lately." I smiled, not fully understanding, though I should have. I offered her more tea. She declined. Then, while rinsing her plate, not even mine, just hers, she turned to me and said without any sharpness, as if it were just fact, "You know, Mom, you don't have to do all this. You don't have to try so hard. It's not really your role anymore." Her voice wasn't cruel, but her words landed like a frost. I didn't know what to say. My role. What role did she think I had played all these years, costume or character? I kept wiping the same spot on the counter, my hand trembling just slightly. She didn't notice. Or she did, and chose not to. She left shortly after that, kissing my cheek the way people do when they're already halfway out the door, and I stood in that kitchen alone, the tea gone cold, the kiwi untouched. I leaned on the sink and looked out the window. There were 2 birds on the fence, little things hopping closer and away from each other in some kind of private dance. I envied their simplicity, their unspoken bond. I used to think that's what I had with my daughter, but that morning I realized it had shifted. Not in a fiery way, no betrayal shouted into the room. Just the kind of shift that's quiet, like tectonic plates rearranging themselves beneath the foundation of a house. I spent the rest of the day cleaning things that didn't need cleaning, wiping down shelves, refolding blankets, rearranging the spice rack. Something about the order calmed me. Something about control, even in small ways, gave my mind something to hold on to. Because inside something had cracked. Not loud, just a hairline fracture. But it was the kind of crack you feel in your bones before you ever see it on the surface. That night, I pulled out an old photo album. I sat on the living room rug, legs crossed like I used to when she was young, and we'd build forts out of cushions. I looked at her baby pictures, her chubby cheeks, her first day of school, her prom dress, and wondered when exactly I'd stopped being enough. Or maybe I never had been. Maybe I was always holding on to a version of us that only existed in my head. The album stayed open beside me as I fell asleep on the couch, and in the silence of that night, with only the ticking wall clock to keep me company, I started to hear it. That soft voice inside the one I hadn't listened to in years, the one that said this isn't how it's supposed to feel. A few days later, I received a message not from my daughter, but from my cousin's niece, who's always been more active online than anyone else in the family. It was a group message, one of those forwarded things people send without thinking. A flyer digitally designed with pastel florals and elegant cursive, family brunch, celebrating new beginnings. It had the date, time, location, and a list of names underneath RSVP to so-and-so. I stared at it for a long time. At first I thought it was a mistake. Surely I had just missed the earlier message. Maybe she meant to call. Maybe something had distracted her, and I'd get a follow-up in an hour or two. I refreshed my messages, checked my email. Nothing. The silence was more than silence. It was clarity disguised as oversight. The brunch was scheduled for Saturday. By Wednesday, I still hadn't heard from her. I debated calling, but a voice in me whispered not to. Not because I didn't want to go, but because I wanted to see how long it would take for her to realize I wasn't invited. Thursday came and went. On Friday, I ran into an old neighbor at the market who said, "Excited for the family brunch. Your daughter must be over the moon." I nodded, smiled politely, and felt something inside me crumble like stale bread. Saturday morning arrived like any other. I boiled water for tea, dressed in my soft cream cardigan, brushed my hair back into a loose bun. I had nowhere to be, and yet I found myself sitting in the kitchen watching the time crawl across the oven clock. 10 o'clock, 11, noon. The brunch must be wrapping up now. I wondered who sat beside her, if they raised their glasses, if they toasted her new life, her new family, without thinking for even a moment about the woman who gave her life. I tried not to cry. Tears would have made it seem like I was broken, but I wasn't. Not yet. I was slowly hardening, not into something bitter, but into something wise, like old trees that stop blooming but still grow taller in silence. That afternoon I got a photo, not from her, from the same cousin's niece again. A group picture, everyone's smiling arms looped together, her fiancé holding her close. And there she was, my daughter, in a delicate dress, laughing, and there I wasn't. I zoomed in. The centerpiece on the table was mine. I'd made it for her last birthday. She hadn't even mentioned borrowing it. I noticed the tablecloth was from the old linen set her grandmother gave us. My table, my fabric, my family, my daughter. All part of a gathering I hadn't even known was happening. I was a ghost who'd lent out her furniture. That night I didn't sleep well. The dreams were heavy and muddled, full of doors that wouldn't open and voices that trailed away before I could answer. I woke up before dawn, the kind of waking where your heart already hurts and your mind rushes to explain why. I didn't need reminding. My absence was loud in my bones. It wasn't just about a brunch. It wasn't just about a missed invitation. It was the realization that I was being carefully moved to the margins, as though I were a character from a previous chapter who didn't fit the aesthetic of the new storyline. It hurt, not in a dramatic, theatrical way, but in a slow creeping way, like cold setting into old joints. You don't scream. You just notice you've stopped moving as freely as you once did. I began to write that morning. Not a letter, not a confrontation, just thoughts, feelings, questions. I started a notebook I hadn't touched in years. I wrote down everything I remembered from that first birthday I threw for her, how I had baked 3 cakes because she couldn't decide on one flavor, how I had spent hours blowing up pink balloons, how her face lit up when she walked into the room and shouted, "This is all for me." Yes, it was always all for her, but maybe that had been the mistake. Maybe in giving her everything I had taught her, that I was nothing more than a giver, that I didn't need to be considered, that my absence would be as convenient as my presence had once been comforting. I closed the notebook and stared at the ceiling for a long while. The fan hummed softly. Outside, the world carried on. I realized then this wasn't going to be a single moment of betrayal. This was going to be a slow erosion, and if I wasn't careful, there'd be nothing left of me but the empty outline of someone who used to matter. It was a few days later when I saw the full guest list, not because she sent it to me. No, that would have implied some inclusion, even if just as a courtesy. I saw it on her fiancé's social media page, a tagged story, public for the world to see as if my absence were nothing more than a matter of decor, a forgotten napkin at the edge of a perfect table setting. I hesitated before clicking through the photos, half hoping I'd find my name, my face, something, anything to say I still belonged. But what I saw instead was a list of smiles that didn't include me, a family lineup with a missing piece. No one seemed to notice. Her fiancé had posted a caption under one of the photos, "Only the people who'll be part of our real future made it to the table." That phrase, that word real, it curled around my ribs like wire. What was I then? Imagined outdated, a placeholder that had expired. The people included were almost entirely his side. Aunts, uncles, friends who looked like they came from the same catalog. Polished smiles, all minimalist style and curated charm. Her cousin who used to spend summers in my backyard climbing apple trees wasn't there. Neither was her godmother who held her at the baptism in that lace gown we all wept over. The more I looked, the more I realized they weren't just trimming the list for convenience. They were curating a narrative, one where I didn't belong. And then I noticed something even smaller but more telling. In the background of one photo, hanging by the entryway of their home, was a framed quote, "Surround yourself with people who match your energy." It was a beautiful font, clean, modern, pretentious. I felt a chill, not because of the words themselves, but because of what they implied. That love, history, loyalty, none of it mattered if you didn't fit the vibe. What was the vibe exactly? Was it youth? Was it a certain look, a certain way of speaking, of living, of arranging a living room? Had I missed the silent memo that motherhood had an expiration date, that somewhere along the line the woman who kissed, scraped knees, and stayed up during fevers became too much for Instagram? I tried to distract myself. I washed laundry I didn't need to wash. I organized the pantry. I even considered buying new clothes, thinking maybe if I looked more the part they'd remember I belonged. But the thought felt ridiculous even as it came. I wasn't supposed to audition for a place at a table I had built. Later that week, I ran into her childhood piano teacher at the pharmacy. We made the kind of small talk people make when they know too much, but aren't sure how much they're allowed to say. Eventually, she leaned closer and whispered, "I saw the photos. You weren't there." I smiled gently, pretending I was fine. That I had been invited but chose not to go. That I had more important things, that maybe I was under the weather. Lies are easier than pity. She nodded, patting my arm. "They're young," she said, as if youth were some kind of hall pass for cruelty. I went home and stood in the hallway for a long time. I didn't turn on any lights. I just stood there, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the house, settling the silence, pressing around me like water against glass. I thought about all the parties I had thrown, all the birthdays, the sleepovers, the school projects I stayed up helping with. I thought about how her laughter used to ring through these walls, and how now all I had were the echoes. It wasn't the party that hurt. It was the effort to erase me, the deliberate architecture of exclusion. Like they weren't just building a future without me, they were rewriting the past to pretend I'd never mattered at all. That night I sat with my old planner. I flipped through the pages from years ago, handwritten reminders, pick up dress for recital, bake cupcakes for class, call doctor about ear infection. Every page was full of her. My days had been a map of her life. I traced my finger over the ink, wondering how something so permanent could feel so disposable now. And then the thought came, not bitter, not angry, just resolute. Maybe I couldn't stop them from building their new life. Maybe I couldn't force them to remember. but I could decide what pieces of me they didn't get to take with them. I could choose for the first time in a long time to protect the parts of me they hadn't yet commodified. And so I closed the planner and made a decision. If they were writing a story without me, then I'd write one where I didn't need their invitation to feel whole. It wasn't always this way. There was a time not that long ago when she would light up just seeing me walk into a room. Her eyes would soften, and she'd tilt her head the way she used to when she was little, like I was the one safe constant in the world. But lately at that brunch especially, I noticed something had changed. It wasn't outright hostility. That would have been easier in some ways. It was detachment, performance, a practiced kindness that felt like it had been rehearsed in front of a mirror. They smiled at me, sure, but not warmly. Their smiles were hollow, like glass ornaments, fragile, shiny, and breakable with the lightest touch. Her fiancé in particular. I remember how he held the chair out for me, the way he said, "It's so nice to see you again." The words were correct, but his eyes told a different story. There was no warmth in them, only tolerance. I could feel it like a draft sneaking in through a window you thought you'd closed. And it wasn't just him. It was the way she glanced at me when I tried to join a conversation, the way she quickly turned back to him, as though redirecting her focus was the polite way to shut me out. I tried to talk about something familiar, a childhood memory, a family trip she used to love, but it landed flat, like I'd brought an old relic to a modern showroom. He didn't even try to hide it. "Oh," he said, smiling thinly, "you really hold on to the past, don't you?" I laughed softly because I didn't know what else to do, but something inside me twisted. I hadn't realized that memory, our shared story, had become a punchline in someone else's performance. I excused myself to the restroom, not long after, not because I needed to go, but because I needed to breathe. In the hallway, I paused by a photograph on the wall. It was new. The two of them on a mountaintop arms, wrapped tightly wind in their hair. Underneath it was a little plaque, "Our true beginning." I stared at it for a long time. That word again. True. What was false then, everything before him, before now, was I part of a version of her life she'd outgrown, like a childhood diary, or a sweater that no longer fit. When I returned to the table, no one had noticed I'd been gone. I sat quietly for the rest of the meal. I watched them pass dishes, clink glasses, laugh at each other's stories. Every now and then someone would glance my way and include me just enough to keep me from being a ghost, not enough to make me real. And the worst part, she was glowing. Not in the way I remembered when she used to come home from school with art projects and a toothy grin, but in a new way, polished and performative like a magazine spread. She was becoming someone else, and I couldn't tell whether that was her choice or if she'd been convinced it was the only way to move forward. After the meal, I helped clear plates, even though no one asked me to. It's what I've always done. I washed the dishes slowly, the warmth of the water soothing my hands, giving me something to focus on that didn't require me to smile. I could hear them in the other room laughing, planning, dreaming. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was just fading. On my way out, I hugged her. She let me, but it was brief, like holding air. Her arms barely touched my back, and when we pulled apart, she was already turning to say something to someone else. I whispered, "I love you," and she smiled without looking me in the eye. "Of course, Mom. Of course." 3 words that can mean anything or nothing at all. I drove home in silence. No music, no radio, just the sound of the tires and the steady beat of my heart trying to keep rhythm with a world that had started to move without me. I thought of all the times I'd looked at her with pride, with awe, with joy so full it made me cry. And now I was wondering if she had ever looked at me that way, or if maybe for her I had always just been the scaffolding she used to build something better. I pulled into my driveway, turned off the engine, and sat there for a long time, staring at the house that used to be our home. It looked too big suddenly, too quiet, like a theater after the last show, the stage still lit, but the audience long gone. And in that silence I realized the look they gave me wasn't cruelty, it was erasure, a soft, slow way of telling me, thank you for getting us this far. You're dismissed. It began with the smallest things, a pause in conversation when I entered, a shared look between them, quickly hidden behind a sip of coffee or a phone glance, the kind of barely there tension that to a stranger might seem like nothing. But a mother always knows, especially a mother who has spent her whole life reading the room for storms that never quite arrived, but always threatened to. I started to notice that I was becoming the punctuation mark, an interruption to the flow of whatever narrative they were weaving. One evening, after a quiet dinner at their place, I offered to help clear the dishes. They insisted I sit, so I did, listening to the clatter in the kitchen, smiling at nothing in particular. That's when I heard it. Her voice low, but not low enough. She's just stuck. You know, always with the old stories, the old stuff. It's exhausting. And then is lower still, but amused. Well, your mom lives in a different century. Doesn't mean we have to. They laughed, together. That intimate, muffled kind of laughter that makes it clear you're not in on the joke because you are the joke. I didn't get up. I didn't say a word. I just sat there still as the furniture, like I was learning a new language, one built out of silences and sideways glances. My hands were folded in my lap, but they were trembling, not with anger, with the shattering grief of recognition, that even my presence, my quiet, my effort to blend in to not cause trouble, was now a burden. When they returned, they acted like nothing had happened. She brought me a slice of cake, smiling too brightly. "You'll love this, it's lemon lavender," she said. I smiled back, took the plate, ate the cake, and with every bite I felt something inside me pull back further, like a thread unspooling, slowly, quietly. Over the following weeks, the whispers continued. Not always literal words. Sometimes it was the way a door didn't quite close until I'd walked past it, or the way conversation in the living room shifted when I came down the stairs. I'd hear phrases just clipped at the edges. She wouldn't get it, or let's not bring that up with her, or worst of all, we'll explain it later when it's appropriate. As if I'd become some fragile porcelain relic who couldn't handle the reality of their world. They began speaking about me like I wasn't there even when I was. "She means well," she told her friend one night over wine, "but I don't think she realizes things are different now." I was in the hallway, not even trying to eavesdrop, just walking toward the guest room, and suddenly I felt like a trespasser in a home I used to help clean, decorate, protect. She had built a new life, and in that new life I was the artifact kept in the corner out of sentimentality, but always in the way. I stopped offering to help as much, stopped suggesting plans. The rejections had grown too sharp, too habitual, and I couldn't bear the sound of my own hope falling flat anymore. I became quieter, not out of submission, but as an act of self-preservation. Every smile I gave was a mask. Every visit was a performance. I played the part of the gracious mother who knew her place, even as that place kept shrinking. There was one afternoon that stays lodged in my heart. I had arrived a few minutes early to help with her engagement planning. I let myself in. She had once given me a key back when that still meant something. I stood in the entryway, unsure whether to call out or wait. I heard them upstairs talking. She sounded tense. He sounded dismissive. I didn't want to intrude, but before I could decide to leave, I heard her say, Honestly, sometimes I think she doesn't even realize she's embarrassing. And he said, well, it's your family. I'm just marrying into it. Not we, not us. Her family. A weight she carried, something he was reluctantly accepting as part of the price of marrying her. I stood there in the doorway for a long time before quietly turning around and leaving. I closed the door so gently I don't think they heard it. That evening she called and asked where I'd gone. I told her something had come up. She didn't press. And that somehow hurt most of all, that she didn't sense the break, didn't feel the tremor in the foundation. I sat in my living room that night, hands wrapped around a cup of tea gone lukewarm, and thought about all the times I'd whispered in the dark beside her crib, all the songs I'd hummed when she was sick, the notes I tucked into her lunchbox, the letters I never sent her during college because I thought I should give her space, all the things I had done that she would never know and perhaps never care to. And now I was the subject of whispers. But something shifted in me then, not violently, not like a storm, more like a tide changing. I realized I didn't want to beg, to stay in a room where I was only tolerated. I didn't want to eavesdrop for glimpses of dignity. I didn't want to be whispered about. I wanted to reclaim my own voice. It wouldn't happen all at once, but the listening was over. The erasure had been quiet. My answer would be quieter still. It was a phrase tucked inside a conversation so small you'd miss it if you weren't already carrying the bruises of 1,000 similar moments. We were at her new apartment, a sleek space with gray walls and brushed gold fixtures, the kind of place that looked designed for photos rather than life. I'd brought over a small potted plant, lavender, her favorite when she was little. She placed it on the counter, smiled politely, then didn't look at it again. Her friend had come by to help her organize wedding samples, swatches of napkin fabrics, save the date cards, tiny ceramic figurines that would sit on top of the cake like they mattered. I sat quietly sipping from the teacup she'd offered, trying not to be in the way. I wasn't invited to the conversation. Not really. I was scenery, a background extra in the play of her new life. They were discussing seating arrangements. We need to figure out how to separate them, she said to her friend, pointing at 2 sticky notes on the mock table layout. My mom's side is, well, you know, they're a bit much. Very sentimental, very loud. You know how that side of the family is. That side of the family. She said it without thinking. No malice, no venom, just convenience, categorization. Like a closet she didn't want to open at the party. I don't think she even realized what she'd said, how it cut not like a knife, but like paper, small, sharp, and invisible to others. I excused myself to the bathroom, not because I needed to go, but because my hands had started shaking. I stared at myself in the mirror. I looked tired, older than I remembered. I had dressed carefully that morning, soft mauve cardigan, a brooch I hadn't worn in years. I wanted to look nice for her, wanted to be someone she'd be proud to introduce, to include. But I realized then, in that sterile little bathroom with eucalyptus-scented soap and folded guest towels, that she didn't see me that way anymore, if she ever truly had. When I returned to the living room, she was laughing with her friend, flipping through a wedding magazine. They didn't notice the slight puffiness under my eyes. Or maybe they did, and decided not to mention it. I sat down, smiled, and listened as they discussed color palettes and signature cocktails. I didn't say anything about what I'd heard, not that day. I just left a little earlier than usual, citing traffic, though there wasn't any. On the drive home, I kept replaying it in my head, that side of the family, a phrase that split me from her, that drew a quiet line in the sand between what she was becoming and where I came from. What was my side of the family, really? The ones who held her as a baby, who sent birthday cards every year, who brought soup when she was sick and knitted her scarves in the winter. The people who remembered her favorite book from 3rd grade, who cried at her graduation, who drove 3 hours just to see her play a tree in the school musical. Those were the ones being dismissed. Those were the ones being airbrushed out of the story. Later that evening, I pulled out an old photo album again. I'd been doing that more lately, not out of nostalgia, but out of defense. I needed to remind myself that I hadn't imagined it, that we had once been close, that there had been love here once. Real, messy, unconditional love. There was a picture. I paused on her 4th birthday. She was wearing a paper crown, frosting on her cheeks, arms flung around my neck, like I was the whole world. In the background was my cousin, the one she now claims is too old-fashioned, and my sister, who she says drinks too much at events. Everyone was laughing. No one was polished. It was loud. It was chaotic. It was love. And now that entire chapter had been categorized under that side. The side she no longer wanted to be associated with, at least not in public. Not when image mattered more than memory. Not when fitting in with his family meant trimming away the parts of herself that didn't align with their brand of elegance. I began to feel something unfamiliar, a mix of grief and awakening, because I realized I'd been begging without words, without even knowing for her to see me again, for her to choose me. But people don't always recognize what they're choosing to forget. They just do it quietly, 1 inch at a time. So I started to pull back, not in anger, but in a kind of sacred self-preservation. I stopped texting every day, stopped offering to help with the wedding, stopped asking about the next gathering. And she didn't seem to notice the silence. Or maybe she welcomed it. I began writing more, not to her, not yet, just to myself. I wrote about the hurt, about the silence, about what it means to be categorized as an inconvenience. I wrote because words were the only way I could gather the parts of me she was trying to unwrite. And one night I wrote something that stuck with me. If they want to divide me into sides, let them. But I will be the side that remembers, the side that loved first, the side that will not vanish just because it no longer fits in a frame. It was a moment I wasn't supposed to hear, one of those in-between unguarded conversations that falls out of someone's mouth when they think no one's paying attention. I had come over early that day to drop off a book I thought she might like, an old poetry collection, the same one I used to read her from when she was small. I didn't ring the bell because I had the key. She told me once, "You're always welcome, Mom." I clung to those words longer than I should have. I stepped inside quietly, expecting to hear her humming in the kitchen or the kettle whistling. Instead, I heard voices, hers and his, drifting in from the back patio just beyond the sliding door. "I just think it's going to be a mess if they're all there," he said. Her voice came next, hesitant. "It's still my family, though." He laughed. "Sure, but they don't belong, babe. Not in this kind of wedding. You know what I mean." I stopped moving. That phrase, "they don't belong," hung in the air like smoke, dense, lingering, impossible to unhear. He said it so casually, like he was talking about a mismatched centerpiece or an out-of-date playlist. But he was talking about us, my family, my history, the people who raised her, me. She didn't argue, not really. She just sighed and said, "We'll figure it out." And that was what did it. Not just his words, but her silence. I stepped back, closed the door as quietly as I had entered, and left. The book still in my hands, never delivered. I sat in my car for nearly an hour, gripping the steering wheel, my heart beating so hard it made my hands ache. I didn't cry. Not then. I just stared ahead at nothing, the kind of stare that doesn't see anything because it's too busy remembering everything. That phrase echoed in my mind for days after. They don't belong. Over and over. It burrowed into me, reawakened every moment I'd tried to ignore, every sign I'd brushed off with hopeful excuses. It wasn't just an offhand remark. It was a confirmation. A confirmation that he didn't see us as people, just as clutter, baggage, aesthetic mismatch, something to be politely excluded. And worse, she didn't correct him. I thought about all the weddings I had been to, all the ones I helped plan, back when we believed every family was a woven tapestry, messy but whole. We never worried about belonging. We just gathered, celebrated, cried, danced. But this wedding wasn't about union. It was about performance. A performance I didn't have a role in. For the first time, I began to think seriously about the will. It wasn't revenge. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't some bitter scheme to punish her. It was something deeper. It was about clarity, about finally seeing the lines they had drawn, and realizing I didn't have to stand on the side I'd been pushed to. I had the right to decide what story I left behind, what legacy I handed over, and who would carry it with care. That weekend, I met with an old friend, an estate planner I hadn't spoken to in years. I didn't give her the details. I didn't need to. She looked at me across her tidy desk, saw the quiet grief in my eyes, and simply said, "Tell me who you trust." It took me a long time to answer, not because I didn't know, but because admitting it felt like closing a door I had spent my entire life keeping open. I thought of the nurse who came by weekly to check on me, always kind, always gentle. She remembered my tea order, asked about my garden, sat and listened like time was endless. She never once asked for anything, yet gave me the feeling of being seen. I said her name. That evening, I sat in my living room, the paperwork still warm from the folder, and looked around at the house I had built, not with money, but with memory. I touched the wall where we'd marked my daughter's height each year. I ran my fingers over the worn edges of the couch where we used to read stories. I breathed in the scent of cinnamon and lavender, the smell of holidays and comfort. And then I thought about those words again. They don't belong. And I knew suddenly that he was wrong, that maybe they didn't belong in my story anymore. Because here's the truth. No one tells you just because you gave someone everything doesn't mean they'll see your worth when you stop being useful to them. And just because someone once came from your body doesn't mean they still hold space for your heart. That night I wrote a letter, not to her, not to anyone really, just to myself, and at the end of it I wrote, "They said I don't belong, so I chose to belong to myself." It was her bridal shower that finally made it impossible to pretend. She invited me, of course, out of formality, I imagine, and I went, not because I wanted to be there, but because I still clung to the hope that somewhere behind the curated smiles and delicate pastries, I would find a glimpse of the girl I raised, the one who used to wrap her arms around me like I was the safest place in the world. The venue was a converted greenhouse cafe, the kind of place where everything was blush-colored and softly lit. Her friends floated around in neutral dresses and wide-brimmed hats, sipping champagne and posing for photos near a wall of fake roses that spelled out, "Future Mrs." I stood near the back, holding a small gift bag, lavender lotion, and a handwritten card, feeling like I had wandered into someone else's dream. She greeted me with a smile, one of those smiles, the kind people give to coworkers at retirement parties, kind composed, but utterly vacant. She hugged me lightly, her arms cold. "So glad you made it, Mom," she said, and then moved on to the next person. I watched her float through the room like a hostess in a show she didn't write, but knew how to perform. Everything about the event felt practiced. Her laugh, her words, even her posture. It was all performance. I tried to strike up a few conversations, but each time I mentioned something from our past childhood birthdays, favorite family recipes that tripped to the mountains, they blinked politely and nodded before drifting away. My memories were too bulky for the air they breathed, too sentimental, too unfiltered. One of her bridesmaids leaned in once and whispered with a smile, "You must be so proud. She's really found her aesthetic." Aesthetic. As if her life was a mood board, as if marriage were just another branding opportunity. I sat at the edge of the long white table watching her open gifts. Every time she lifted the lid of a new box, she gave the same rehearsed reaction. Mouth open, eyes, wide squeal of delight, then a quick thank you and move on. When she got to mine, she paused. The room quieted just slightly. She opened the gift, pulled out the lavender lotion and the card. She didn't read it aloud, just smiled, nodded, said, "Thanks, Mom," and placed it behind her, as if it were a footnote to the chapter she was writing. I knew then that I was not a part of this story. I was the epilogue to a book she'd stopped reading. Later, as the group posed for a picture, her in the center, arms around her friends, I stood just outside the frame. No one invited me in. And I didn't step forward. I just watched how natural it had become for her to arrange her life without me in the picture. And still I stayed until the end, helped clean up napkins and empty glasses, took out the trash while the rest of them hugged and promised to meet for drinks. She hugged me again before I left, this time shorter, lighter a tap, more than an embrace. Driving home, I kept one hand on the wheel and the other resting on the gift bag she hadn't opened all the way. Inside the card I had written, "I hope your marriage feels like home, not performance. I hope you find love that doesn't need an audience." She would probably never read it, or worse, she'd read it and not understand it. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car with the engine running. The sun had started to dip behind the trees, casting long, tired shadows across the yard. I stared at the porch I used to decorate for her birthdays, the steps she'd run down in glittering shoes when her friends arrived, arms full of gift bags and laughter. Those were real smiles, full ones, with teeth and tears and joy you couldn't fake. Now the only smiles I saw from her were the kind you practiced in mirrors, the kind you wear like lipstick, removable. That evening I looked at my will for the first time in years. I read every line slowly, as if studying the DNA of my own legacy. My daughter's name appeared in all the right places. It had been written in when she still believed I hung the stars, when she cried if I left the room too long, when she called me Mama and held my hand in parking lots. The woman I saw now didn't remember that girl, and maybe that girl didn't remember me either. The shift wasn't loud. It didn't come with anger or drama. It came with smiles, with polite thank yous and stiff hugs, with parties I was invited to, but never included in, with that aching realization that being tolerated isn't the same as being loved. So I took a pen and began to underline. Not to cross out, not yet, just to pause to ask myself, who will love what I've built? Who will see the life in these walls, the worth in these memories? Who won't smile at me like I'm just a prop in their backdrop? And the answer rose in me like a slow, steady tide. Not her. Not anymore. I hadn't intended to find the box. I was looking for something else. An old shawl I'd tucked away for colder evenings, or maybe the tin where I kept the good sewing needles. Instead, tucked in the corner of the hallway closet behind a stack of gift bags and unused candles, I found a cardboard box labeled simply Misk, Storage. I recognized the handwriting. Her handwriting. Small, neat. The loops of her letters the same way she used to write her name over and over on her notebooks as a child. I carried it into the living room, set it on the floor and peeled back the flaps like I was opening something sacred, And in a way, I was. Inside were the fragments of a life we once shared, a life I had thought we'd both cherished. Our wedding album. Family photos from birthdays, vacations, ordinary Sundays, the certificate from her piano recital, her first pair of ballet shoes, cards she had drawn for me. I love you, Mommy, written in crayon with hearts and stick figures. I held each piece like a relic. I didn't cry, not right away. I just stared, heart thudding, slowly, painfully, like an old clock beginning to wind down. These weren't just items, they were proofs, evidence that we had loved each other, that we had been close, that there had been warmth and laughter and 1,000 ordinary miracles. But now they were boxed up, hidden, set aside like seasonal decor no longer suited to the new color palette of her life. I realized something even more painful then. The wall in her new home, the one where she'd arranged gallery frames of her and her fiancé, their travels, their dog, and a little sweater. None of these photos had made the cut, not a single picture of her childhood, not one photo of us. It was as if she had pressed a reset button, and I, along with everything that made her who she is, had been deemed off-brand. I sat on the rug holding a photo of us from her 6th birthday. I'd baked her a cake shaped like a castle, crooked and melting, but she'd loved it. In the photo, she's got frosting on her nose, and I'm laughing, arms wrapped around her, utterly unaware of the camera. That kind of joy, unfiltered, unstyled, doesn't fit into weddings planned with mood boards and Pinterest folders. I whispered to the empty room, I remember this. I remember you. And for a moment, I wondered if she did. I packed the items back into the box slowly. My hands moved like they were folding memories, not things. When I finished, I didn't put it back in the closet. I set it in the middle of the living room floor and just stared at it. It felt like a truth bomb I didn't know how to detonate. If I gave it back to her, would she even want it, or would it just embarrass her? An unwanted reminder of a version of herself she's outgrown. Later that evening, I called her. I told her I'd found the box. I kept my voice light, casual, as if I didn't already know what it meant. Just wondered if you wanted to come get it, or if you'd like me to drop it off. She hesitated. I heard it in her breath. Then she said, maybe just hold on to it for now. I don't really have space. Not I'll come get it soon, or I'd love to look through it with you. Just no space. I said, okay, hung up, and sat there in the quiet that followed, realizing it wasn't just the box she didn't have space for. It was me. And something in me cracked soft and deep, not anger, not even sadness, just clarity. I picked up the photo again, the one with the castle cake, and I smiled, because I knew that moment. I had lived it. I didn't need her permission to treasure it. I didn't need her validation to keep it sacred. That photo was mine too, and it wasn't going back in the box. I placed it on the mantel. Just one photo, one memory, one reminder that I had loved her with everything I had, and that somewhere at some time she had loved me too. But love isn't always permanent, not in the way we hope. Sometimes it changes shape, sometimes it fades, sometimes it gets folded into a cardboard box and labeled miscellaneous. So I sat with that truth quiet and whole. And I knew deeply that I would not be boxed up, not in this life, not in anyone's story. It was a Wednesday afternoon when I offered the dress. I had pulled it carefully from its box, the same one my mother had sealed with lavender sachets and tissue paper decades ago, an heirloom gown, hand-stitched lace, with tiny pearls sewn along the sleeves, the fabric delicate but timeless. It had been passed down through 3 generations. I had worn it. My mother had worn it. And now I had imagined so vividly what my daughter would look like in it. The soft ivory against her skin, the veil trailing behind her like a whisper of all the women who had come before. She didn't even touch it. "Oh," she said, looking at it like it was a relic from a museum she hadn't meant to walk into. "It's really beautiful, Mom, but it's not really the vibe we're going for." The vibe. That word again. As if family history were something to match to a color scheme. As if the past were inconvenient, unless it could be ironed and Instagrammed. I tried to explain, gently. I told her about the tiny stitch in the hem my grandmother had sewn on her wedding morning, a little charm of luck woven by hand. I told her how the dress had survived 3 floods and 2 cross-country moves. I told her it was made not just of silk, but of memory. But her eyes glazed over. She gave me the kind of smile you give someone offering fruitcake at a summer picnic, gracious, but with no intention of partaking. "I just already found something that fits the aesthetic," she said, "but thank you really. It's sweet. Sweet. Like a child's drawing, like a pat on the head, like I had offered something quaint and mildly embarrassing, and she was doing her best not to offend me." I folded the dress carefully, even though my hands were shaking, and returned it to the box. Her fiancé walked in shortly after, and she said lightly, "Mom brought the vintage dress. Can you imagine me in that?" He chuckled, not unkindly, but like it was a joke they both understood. And I realized then that this was not my wedding. This was not even our wedding. It was theirs, a brand, a curated moment, and there was no room for ghosts in curated moments. That weekend she had a dress fitting. She didn't invite me. I found out through a tagged photo her surrounded by friends, champagne flutes in hand, the caption reading, "She said yes to the dress. She looked radiant, and I was happy for her in a way, but I also felt like I'd missed something important, something sacred. I didn't want to pick her dress. I didn't want to control her decisions. I just wanted to be there, to witness, to be part of the becoming. But even witnessing it seemed was too much to ask. The next time I saw her, I brought it up lightly, saw the dress photo, looks like it was a fun day. She smiled, then hesitated. "Oh, yeah, it was kind of last minute." I nodded, pretending to believe her. Pretending the last-minute fitting just happened to include 4 friends, 2 moms from his side, and a professional photographer. She reached for her tea. It's just easier sometimes with people who you know. Get the vibe. There it was again. The vibe. I sipped my tea and stared at the steam curling toward the ceiling. In that moment, I understood something I'd been avoiding for weeks. This wasn't about dresses, or boxes of photographs, or missed invitations. It was about belonging, and I didn't, not anymore. She wasn't being cruel. That was the strangest part. There were no tantrums, no dramatic speeches, just this slow, silent removal, like someone backing away from you into a fog, smiling all the while, waving even, until they disappear. That night I sat in bed with the dress beside me. I ran my hand over the fabric, thinking of all the hands that had touched it before mine, the women who had stood tall in it, proud, loved, included. I realized then that tradition only matters if it's honored. Memory only lives if it's invited in. I folded it one last time, not out of defeat, but out of peace. The kind of peace that comes when you stop knocking on a closed door. The next morning, I called the local museum, told them I had an heirloom piece of historical significance. They were honored to accept it, said they'd display it with a note about the women who had worn it, the lives it had held. And I thought maybe that's where it belongs now. Somewhere it will be seen, remembered, valued. Because love that doesn't want your history is not love that deserves your legacy. It was a garden brunch, small and casual, she'd said. A few members of his family in town, nothing fancy, just coffee and light bites. You should come, she offered one day over the phone, the way someone might invite an old neighbor to a neighborhood open house. I told myself it meant something, that maybe this was her way of opening a door again. So I brought a pie, homemade as always. Apple cinnamon with the crust pressed just the way she liked it when she was little, hearts cut into the top with the same cookie cutter we'd used together for years. The garden was lovely white linens, soft jazz floating through the air, tall glasses of sparkling water with sprigs of rosemary. Everything matched. Everyone matched. They stood in clusters, sun hats, linen pants, sunglasses, even though the shade was deep. When I arrived, I scanned the crowd for her, and when I found her, I smiled, like I was reaching through something. She waved me over quick and distracted, then turned back to the man she was speaking with. I waited by her side, hands gently folded, pie balanced carefully in my arms. She didn't pause the conversation, didn't introduce me, didn't say, "This is my mother." She kept talking something about design plans and honeymoon destinations. The man nodded politely at me, as though I were someone's assistant, or perhaps a distant relative best not acknowledged until confirmed. She didn't look at me again. When the conversation ended, she drifted away to greet another guest, and I stood there with my pie feeling like furniture that had been delivered to the wrong house. I eventually made my way to the buffet table and placed the pie down. No one touched it. I overheard someone mention dietary restrictions. "Too much sugar," one of them said. Someone else joked, "I don't think we eat like that anymore." I said nothing, just smiled, took a glass of water, and found a chair far enough from the action that I wouldn't interfere with the curated harmony. I watched her that day, really watched her. The way she tilted her head when she laughed, the way she touched his arm when she wanted his attention, the way her smile changed depending on who she was speaking to. She was glowing again, but not in a way I recognized. It wasn't the joy of being loved, it was the thrill of being admired, approved of. She had become fluent in their world, polished, quietly calculated, effortlessly elegant. When she passed by me once, I reached out. "Sweetheart, do you need help with anything?" She paused, blinked as if I'd startled her, then smiled tightly. "Oh no, everything's covered." She moved on, and I sat there with that answer, everything's covered, feeling the weight of what she hadn't said, that she didn't need me. Not here, not anymore. When it came time for toasts, his mother stood glass raised. "To our beautiful couple," she said, beaming. "We are so proud to welcome her into our family. She's everything we hoped for." Everyone clapped, glasses clinked. She blushed and leaned into his shoulder, and I waited. Just for a glance, a nod, a mention. Nothing came. I left early, no one noticed. I walked to my car slowly, the sun warm on my back. When I sat behind the wheel, I didn't start the engine right away. I just held the steering wheel, my fingers curled around it like I was bracing for impact, even though nothing had happened. But that's the thing about grief, it doesn't need an explosion. Sometimes it's just a slow flood, a trickle of moments when you realize you are no longer someone's person. You are no longer necessary. When I got home, I washed the pie dish even though it hadn't been touched. I placed it back on the shelf, then sat on the edge of my bed staring out the window. The world outside looked exactly the same, but I had changed. Something had shifted in me, quiet and irrevocable. I picked up the notebook I'd started, the one filled with small heartbreaks and realizations, and I wrote down just one sentence. It's not that I wasn't introduced. It's that she didn't think I needed to be. I sat with that line until the sun slipped behind the houses and the room filled with blue shadows. And in that stillness, I let go of something I'd been holding on to for too long, the belief that love once given would always make space for you. Some loves close the door behind them and don't leave a key. It happened in the smallest, sharpest way, like a whisper with teeth. I'd stopped by her place to drop off some recipes. She had once said she wanted my banana bread, the holiday cider, a few others. They were handwritten, each one on a card worn soft at the corners, stained with butter and cinnamon, creased from years of being folded into aprons and drawers. I thought she might want them. I thought maybe, foolishly, that those little pieces of tradition might still hold some value. She wasn't home, but he was. He opened the door with that same neutral smile he always wore around me. Barely polite, barely warm, like a host tolerating a guest who stayed 1 hour too long. "Oh, he said I think she mentioned you might come by. You can just leave those on the counter." I stepped inside for only a moment, the silence between us stretching too far, like a hallway you wish would end. On the table were blueprints, not for the wedding, for a house. Their house. I didn't mean to look. I didn't want to look, but it was right there, floor plans, cost breakdowns, a printed checklist titled, "After the Wedding Phase 1 Renovations," and on the notepad beside it, scribbled in her handwriting, were the words, "Use Mom's house money," followed by a little check mark. I froze. I stared at it like it might disappear if I blinked, but it didn't. It stayed right there, black ink on cream paper, a quiet betrayal, sitting in plain sight. I didn't say a word. I placed the recipe cards on the kitchen counter, as carefully as if they were made of glass, and turned to leave. He didn't stop me. That night I lay in bed with the memory of those 2 words, Mom's house, burning at the front of my mind. They weren't waiting until I passed. They weren't even pretending anymore. They were planning, anticipating, making decisions about my life as if it had already ended, as if I were a placeholder, an outdated resource whose usefulness had an expiration date. I tried to convince myself that maybe it was just speculation. Maybe she hadn't meant anything by it. But a few days later, I overheard them again, this time together. They were in my backyard, sitting on the bench near the lilac bush I planted when she was born. I had stepped outside quietly to tend to the garden, but I stopped short when I heard her voice. "It's a big property. If we take out the guest suite and open the kitchen..." He interrupted, "We'd double the value." She nodded. "She won't need all that space eventually. We could offer to manage it for her." Manage it. Not share it, not honor it. Manage. Like a portfolio. Like a piece of stock. Like a tool. And I stood there just a few feet away, invisible as breath, my hands in the dirt, my heart hollowed out. I thought of everything that house had held her first steps across the kitchen tiles, the nights I stayed up sewing costumes for school plays, the nights I sat by the window when she was out too late praying she'd come home safe. The walls had absorbed every version of her, of us, and now she was planning to tear them down. I didn't confront her. Not then. Instead, I walked through that house that evening, touching everything like it was already gone. I ran my fingers along the wood banister, traced the grooves in the door frame where I'd marked her height each birthday. I opened the drawers that still held her old report cards, the closet with her high school prom dress I hadn't had the heart to throw away. And then I sat at my desk, pulled out the will, and stared at it for a long time. She was listed for everything. The house, the savings, the heirlooms. I had written it all in long ago without hesitation, back when I believed love was a kind of guarantee, a covenant. Back when I thought she'd protect what I passed on the same way I had protected her, even from herself. But she wasn't protecting it. She was preparing to gut it. Not for malice, not even for greed, but for convenience, for her new life. for their version of the future which no longer had space for mine. I picked up my pen and drew a line through her name. It was just ink, just a stroke on paper, but it felt like slicing a cord. I didn't replace it with another name, not yet. I just left the space blank and stared at it. A silence, a waiting. The next morning she called, casual, light. "Hey, I meant to ask, could we come by next week to measure the front windows? Just curious about sizes for future planning." I smiled. "Let's talk another time," I said gently and hung up. I stood by the window watching the sun rise over the lawn I'd mowed for 30 years and whispered to no one, "It's not yours. Not yet. Maybe not ever." It was a simple idea, a farewell to summer, I had said. Nothing grand, just a dinner, a way to gather before the season turned. I'd made all her favorites, roasted rosemary chicken, scalloped potatoes, those green beans with toasted almonds she used to scoop onto her plate with both hands when she was little. I even baked a peach cobbler, letting the crust brown just enough to crack at the corners like the ones my mother used to make. I spent the day humming to myself in the kitchen wearing the apron she gave me years ago, the one embroidered with "World's Best Mom." The stitching had faded, but I still wore it like a badge. I lit candles, set the table with linen napkins, polished the silverware. When they arrived, I greeted them at the door with a kiss on the cheek, a soft smile, the warmth of someone who still believed hospitality was a kind of love language. She complimented the table. "So cozy, Mom," and then slipped her phone into her fiancé's hands and posed beside the flowers. He didn't look up once during the meal. They sat, but not fully, not in the way people do when they're present. He scrolled his phone under the table. She half listened, half texted. I tried to fill the silence with stories, ones I thought would make her laugh, ones that had once been her favorites. "Remember the time you snuck that cupcake from the fridge before breakfast?" I said, chuckling, spooning more potatoes onto her plate. She nodded vaguely. "Yeah, I think so." She didn't. Halfway through dinner, he stood up and said, "I'm just going to order something. I don't do butter-heavy meals. My stomach can't take it." He said it as if I weren't sitting right there, as if the food I had prepared with care was an inconvenience, a mistake. My daughter said nothing. She didn't touch her green beans, just picked at the chicken and said she wasn't that hungry. "We're trying intermittent fasting," she mumbled, "trying to, be more intentional." Intentional. It struck me how many words they use to explain their absence. Vibe, aesthetic, intentional. All those words dressed up as progress, when really they were just ways to step farther away from where they came from. When he returned with takeout, something grainy and wrapped in brown paper, they both laughed at something I couldn't hear. The scent of rosemary and garlic faded beneath the sour sting of vinegar dressing and kale. I sat there with my cobbler untouched, my best dishes untouched, and I realized this would be the last time. The last time I'd cook with that kind of hope. The last time I'd believe I could reach her through flavor, through warmth, through the memories stitched into every recipe. She wasn't tasting any of it. She wasn't even hungry for the food for the past for me. After dinner, I began clearing the plates. They didn't stop me, didn't insist I sit or ask how I was. They moved to the couch where she curled up with her phone, and he put on a show I didn't recognize. Loud voices fast editing too much color. I turned on the faucet, washing the dishes slowly, the bubbles rising around my hands, the warmth of the water, the only comfort left in that moment. I listened to them laugh from the other room. Not with me, not about me, just laughter that no longer included me. When they left, she kissed my cheek again, lightly like always. "Thanks, Mom. It was really sweet of you." Sweet. That word again. That word that meant this was nice, but I won't remember it. After they drove off, I returned to the table. One of the candles had burned all the way down. Wax spilled onto the tablecloth. The flowers had begun to wilt. I sat down and looked at the untouched cobbler. I wrapped it up, placed it in the fridge, and stood in the hallway for a long while, unsure of where to go next. Every room felt a little smaller, every photo on the wall a little dimmer. I thought of all the dinners before this, the toddler tantrums, the birthday cakes, the nights of mac and cheese with cartoons playing in the background, the Thanksgiving when the power went out and we ate by candlelight laughing as if the whole world had conspired to give us magic. Where had that girl gone? I went to bed with the window open. The air was cooling already. Summer was ending, and with it so was something else, something harder to name. That night I didn't dream. I woke with the clearest thought I'd had in months. Love isn't a meal to be served again and again in hopes someone will be hungry. Sometimes it's okay to stop cooking. It didn't happen all at once. That's the hardest part to explain. There was no single day when the house emptied of joy. No dramatic fight, no slammed doors, just a slow drifting, like smoke curling from the end of a candle's flame. One moment it's warm and dancing, the next it's just air again. The morning after that dinner, I woke early long before the sun had crested the rooftops. The house was so quiet it almost hummed. I made tea and didn't even wait for the water to boil properly, just enough heat to feel like I was doing something. I sat at the kitchen table, still set with placemats no one had used, and watched the steam rise slow and soft, like breath on a cold window. I could still smell the rosemary. It clung to the curtains, the dish towels, my hair, but instead of comfort, it felt haunting. An echo of a warmth that no longer reached me. I looked around the house and realized how large it suddenly felt, not in size but in distance. The space between each chair, the silence between rooms, the weight of objects that used to be shared. I wandered from room to room, touching the edges of things, not to clean or arrange, but just to remind myself they were still there, still mine. In the guest room, I saw the slippers I'd placed out for her, the ones she never touched. In the bathroom, the lavender soap remained unopened, the one I'd picked just for her. Every little effort unacknowledged, every gesture overlooked. And still I loved her. I couldn't not. But love without reciprocity becomes something else. It becomes labor, a quiet, tireless labor that wears you down bone by bone. I was tired, not just physically, but in the way that sinks deep into your ribs, a tiredness that came from being too careful with someone who had stopped being careful with you. By afternoon, I had found myself in the attic. I don't know what led me there, only that I needed to be above it all somehow. Among the boxes, the dust, the things we store away because we think we might need them again, even when we know deep down we won't. I found her baby blanket, the yellow one with the stitched sun in the corner. She used to drag it everywhere. It had holes in it, frayed edges. I used to try and sew it back together when she wasn't looking, as if I could keep it whole, keep her whole. I held it to my face and breathed in whatever memory still clung to it, and I wept, not loudly, not angrily, just tears slipping down like something old being released. Later, I sat in the living room and stared out the window for what must have been an hour. I wasn't waiting for anything. That was new. I had spent years waiting for her to call to visit, to remember, but that day I realized I had finally stopped. And in the absence of waiting, a new space opened up. Not happiness, not yet, but honesty. She was never going to come back, not to the version of us I had carried in my heart, and I couldn't keep living as if she would. That evening, I poured a glass of wine and lit a candle, not to set the mood, not to impress anyone. Just for me, just to remind myself that presence didn't always require another body in the room. I sat on the porch as the sun dipped low, coloring the trees with that final burst of gold, the kind of light that only lasts a moment, but makes everything look like it's been forgiven. The nurse called, just to check in. She always called at the end of the week. Her voice was soft, real. She asked about my day, listened when I spoke, not out of obligation, but out of genuine care. She didn't know every detail of my past, but she treated every word I gave her like it mattered. And that meant something. It meant a lot. After we hung up, I looked at the wall near the front door where the old framed family photo used to hang. I had taken it down that morning, not out of spite, but because the faces in that photo no longer lived in this house. The woman in that frame had been trying to be everything to everyone, and it had almost cost her herself. In its place, I hung a painting, a landscape, mountains, wide sky, a river moving quietly through the middle. I don't know where I got it or why I'd kept it all these years, but looking at it, then it felt right, still, strong, unconcerned with being understood. I stood back and let the quiet settle around me, not as an enemy, but as a companion. It was strange at first, this solitude, but it wasn't loneliness, not anymore. It was space, real, honest space. And in that space, something was beginning to bloom. Something like peace. It was a Wednesday morning, cloudless bright, the kind of day where nothing should feel heavy, and yet everything did. I'd placed the will on the kitchen table beside a black pen and a blank pad of paper. No music, no radio, just me, the soft clink of the spoon in my tea, and the quiet thunder of a decision I'd been circling for weeks. I had already crossed out her name once, left it blank, let the absence breathe. But that morning I wasn't there to hesitate. I was there to decide. They had stopped calling. After the dinner, after the pie, after the plans for my house whispered in the garden, the silence had settled in. At first it stung, then it dulled. Now it just was. Like the weather, like the way my knees ached before it rained. I thought back to the woman who had been checking on me lately, my nurse. She never pushed, never pried. She brought soup sometimes, sat with me when my hip hurt, laughed when I told her stories, even the ones with no punchline. She remembered things, small things, like how I hated too much ice in my water, or how I liked the sound of wind chimes at night. She noticed when I looked tired. She always asked if I'd eaten. She never asked what I could give her. That mattered. The pen felt light in my hand, lighter than I expected. I began to write, not out of anger, not out of grief, but out of a clarity that comes only after you've been forgotten, slowly, tenderly, and with a smile. I didn't write her name. I didn't write his. I wrote the name of someone who had shown up not with grandeur, not with flowers, but with presence, with dignity. I paused only once, to breathe, to look out the window at the lilac bush, still blooming even now. And then I kept going. When I was done, I signed my name, slowly, the same way I used to sign permission slips, birthday cards, field trip waivers. But this signature, this one was for me, for the woman who had spent her life giving, forgiving, explaining, for the mother who had finally learned that not all silence means peace, and not all family means home. I folded the papers, placed them in the envelope, and set it in the drawer. No announcement, no letter, no confrontation. They didn't need to know, not right away. This wasn't a performance. This wasn't a lesson. It was a boundary. Later that evening, I made a small dinner, just enough for one. I set the table, lit a candle, not out of habit, but because it brought me joy. I played a little jazz from the radio, opened the window to let in the cool breeze. It smelled like summer ending and something else beginning. As I washed the dishes, I thought of everything I'd carried: the birthdays, the school plays, the scraped knees, the late-night phone calls, the quiet meals. And I smiled not because it was all easy, but because I had loved so fully, even when it wasn't returned. And now I was loving myself that way. No parade, no speech. Just a pen. Just a signature. Just a choice to remember my own worth without asking for permission. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't raise a hand. I raised a pen. And in that quiet motion, I reclaimed the story.